Cool. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I know it's getting late on a Friday, the last day of NDC, and I suspect you're all getting a little bit tired, but I very much appreciate you coming out. Real quickly about myself, my name is Edward Thomson. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. I work on Visual Studio Team Services. If you've never heard of Visual Studio Team Services, it's kind of our hub for software development. You know, we do source code hosting, work item tracking, continuous integration, continuous delivery. And I work on the Git side of VSTS. I am also the maintainer of the libgit2 project. It's an open source project. So I'm rather involved with open source in my team. And so today I want to talk a little bit about how you can adopt open source in your organizations. The problem is that I don't really know all of your organizations. I really only know about my organization. I really only know, to be honest with you, about Microsoft. So let me tell you a little bit about how we adopted open source at Microsoft. And we've been really very successful with that. And I think that you know, by learning these lessons along the way, I think that you can take these into your organization and be successful with open source there. Because we have been, you know, I'm really proud of the success that we've had at Microsoft. This is our CEO, Satya Nadella, standing in front of a big board talking about how Microsoft loves Linux. This is unthinkable like 10 years ago. And not only that, Microsoft is the largest contributor, the organization with the most contributors to open source projects on GitHub. So Microsoft, you know, we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we are doing a lot of great things with open source, and I'm really proud of how far we've come. Because it wasn't always like this at Microsoft. If I look back to when I joined Microsoft, that was 2009, I came into Microsoft through an acquisition. Microsoft bought this tiny little company that I worked for. We were headquartered in a cornfield in Illinois. We had 4 engineers, and we were building enterprise version control software. I think at our peak we had 5 engineers, but 4 or 5 engineers cannot build enterprise software effectively unless you're using off-the-shelf components. And for us, that meant open source. So at Teamprise, at this tiny little company, we were using tons and tons of open source, and that's how we were able to get our software out the door. We were building a plugin to the Eclipse IDE, a standalone GUI client, and a command line client, and we were doing it for cross-platforms for enterprises, so Linux, Mac, and Windows. Well, actually, those were just the 3 like good, easy-to-implement operating systems. We also had a version for Solaris, for HPUX, for AIX. At one point, we had an S390 mainframe client. You can't build all this with 4 developers unless you're using open source. But we did build it, and we were really happy with the result. And Microsoft, in fact, was happy, and they came to come and buy us. If you've ever had your software company acquired, the first thing that Microsoft shows up to do is they want to look at the books. They want to do due diligence. They want to audit your financial records, make sure you're not skimming money off the top, that you're not like totally insolvent and haven't told them about this. But the second thing that they do is they want to audit your source code. So we had to upload our source code's history to Microsoft, and they dug through it. And the first thing that they were looking for was that it wasn't just total garbage, right? But the second thing that they were looking for was that we owned all the copyrights to all the software that we were selling. The problem is we didn't, like not even remotely. We used a ton of open source software. And Microsoft lost their mind when they saw this. I mean, like this immediately put like this whole deal in jeopardy that lawyers had been talking about and the owners of our company had been working with like senior people at Microsoft about. And they saw this and they're like, what on earth are you doing? You've got all this like open source software, there's GPL software that you're using. How are you possibly doing this, right? The GPL, if you don't know, is what's called a copyleft license. That means that if you make any changes to the software and then publish it, you've got to contribute those changes back to the community. It's really awesome. It gives users of GPL software a lot of rights, but Microsoft was a little hesitant about this. I'm going to walk off the stage. If you look back, it turns out Bill Gates, who you've probably all heard of, was the CEO of Microsoft, and he said that there's this thing called the GPL, the GNU General Public License, that copyleft license, and he says that we disagree with it. He said that he doesn't like open source software because it means that nobody can ever improve it, ever. I like Bill Gates. I think he's done great work as a humanitarian, but this is just bizarre, right? I don't even know what he was thinking when he said this. But at least he was a little bit more measured than his successor, Steve Ballmer, who said that Linux is a cancer. So yeah, when Microsoft came to buy my tiny little company, they basically audited every open source license that we used, every open source project, and they didn't make us get rid of all of them, but they did make us get rid of some of them. And in fact, we went from selling 3 products at Team Prize, that Eclipse plugin, a GUI client, and a standalone command line client. They made us get rid of the GUI client because we used so much open source technology in our cross-platform Windows system that we just had to stop selling it. So Microsoft now sells 2 of those 3 products. So in 2009, it was kind of unthinkable to me that we would ever be at this place in Microsoft where we're doing anything at all useful with open source. It really felt like dark days when I started. So how did we get here? How did Microsoft embrace open source to the manner that it has so far? Well, on my team at least, the first thing that we did was we had a business need for open source. We didn't say, hey guys, I think we should just go crazy and open source everything. We actually needed to use open source software. If we look back in the year 2012, after I had been acquired into Microsoft, I was working on the Team Foundation server team, which is now the Visual Studio Team Services team, the team I'm on today. And in 2012, we looked at what the industry was saying, and we looked at Gartner, who is an industry analyst. They put out this report called the Magic Quadrant. I won't bore you with all the details, but they basically just take every application lifecycle management tool and decide, where to put it on this graph. So like clear cases in here somewhere, and then some other tools. But being to the right is good, and being up at the top is good. And Microsoft was at the highest at the top and the farthest to the right, so we were doing great. At least that's what we thought. The problem with polls is that they don't always tell you everything, because, who does well on polls? Well, New Coke did really well on polls, and it was not good. Also, many of our democratically elected leaders did well on polls. So doing good on a poll doesn't necessarily mean you're doing great work. When we looked at what the people were saying about Team Foundation Server, and I don't want to bore you too much with the details of how version control systems work. But at the time, Team Foundation Server was what's called a checkout, edit, check-in system. That means you need to go and ask this centralized server, hey, can I start editing this file before you do anything? And that's great if you're the Windows team and you have a code base that's 300 gigabytes, because looking to see what files have changed on disk is insanely expensive. So you want something that works in this model. But if you're not Windows, this sucks. If you're a 5-person development team, you don't want to have to sit there and go talk to the server every time you want to edit a file. It is terrible. So in 2012, at Microsoft, on my team, we came out with a new mode of working in Team Foundation Server. It's called an edit, merge, commit type of system. And that way you can just edit a file, you can run status, and the version control system will look around on disk and see what's changed and tell you. It's great. We were really proud of ourselves because in 2012, we'd basically reinvented Subversion that had been already out there on the market in use by many, many developers. So, right. That brings us to what our customers were saying about us. They were not happy. This is just like random stuff I Googled off the internet. They were not in love with Team Foundation Server. The bottom quote is really painful for me because Brandon Bloom, he actually worked at Microsoft when he wrote this. So we weren't even like winning hearts and minds within Microsoft. It was a real bummer. And like every 3-letter acronym, they gave us a terrible name. So in 2012, we had a little bit of catching up to do. And my team, the team that got acquired from Team Prize, the cross-platform team, we were, after we got acquired, like a totally remote team. I lived in Chicago, my buddy Shaw lived in North Carolina, and my buddy Martin lived in Northern Ireland. And we were talking to our version control server, our TFS server, in Redmond. Of course, all of our infrastructure, it's Microsoft, is in Redmond. And one of our connections was flaky. Our internet connections went down. And so we were talking, and we were like, you know what would be awesome is if we could use a distributed version control system. And of course, we laughed at this because at Microsoft, if you're building TFS, you've got to use TFS. So of course, you're going to use this centralized version control system that is TFS. But this idea took hold a little bit. My buddy Martin was like, you know, no, we can do this. We just spent the time putting checkout, edit, check-in system type of functionality into Team Foundation Server. We can put a distributed version control system in a TFS. So we started talking to our customers, and they were like, yeah, dude, it's about time. I'm glad you're going to put Git into Team Foundation Server. And we're like, oh, wait, hold on. So Git was written by a guy named Linus Torvalds. If that name sounds familiar to you, it should. He wrote the Linux kernel that is a cancer. And Git's licensed under the GNU General Public License, that thing that Bill Gates doesn't believe in. So, you know, we slowed our customers down a little bit. We're like, no, we're going to write a distributed version control system. We're going to build our own distributed version control system. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. No. They reminded us that, you know, we hadn't been, you know, making good on our promise about building great version control tools. We built a tool that was great for the Windows team, yes. We built a tool that was great for teams working the size of the TFS team, also great. But the 4- or 5-person development shops still were not impressed by our version control systems, and they did not want another different Microsoft distributed version control system. You know, what does that even look like? I have no idea, but actually, in retrospect, I'm really afraid of what it might do. Our customers were adamant with us that they didn't want some Microsoft DVCS. They wanted Git. So we had to figure out how to get there. I mean, they were simply, no, do not waste your time, do not build anything that's not Git. If you are going to put a distributed version control system into TFS, and you should, it has to be Git. So our business need was dictated to us. We absolutely had to figure out how to put Git with all its GPL and with all its, you know, Linux background into TFS. I hesitate, you know, to say this a little bit, but it's really important that when you find this need that you have for open source, that you don't just kind of invent one. There's a lot of, I love open source. I truly do. I contribute to open source projects in my spare time. I love it. And I think that we should do as much open source as makes possible sense at Microsoft. But a lot of people will come in and say, well, the reason we need to go open source is because it's more secure. And please, for the love of God, don't trot out that silly Eric Raymond quote about how given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. These things do not convince your management. If you're not already doing open source, if you're not already like plugged into how open source works, then telling your manager that it's a recruitment pipeline is probably not going to convince them. Come up with a real, true, actual business need that only some open source project solves. And then that's the first step towards integrating open source into your open source hating company. Okay? So identify that business need. For us, again, it was Git, and it was just given to us by our customers. The second thing you need to do before you just jump on the Git bandwagon, for instance, is to understand your competitive advantage. Understand what makes your company unique in the marketplace. And that's not always so obvious. If we start looking at Git in Team Foundation Server in 2012, we started thinking about how we were going to shove Git into this product that already existed. So a little background, Git stores, you know, Git was built by Linus Torvalds to manage the Linux kernel. It does a great job on a Linux file system. So if you are hosting Git repositories, the absolute most effective way to do that in 2012 was to just put them on a Linux ext3 file system. Boom. And if you look at GitHub's architecture, that's exactly what they did. They became the world's largest Git repository host, and they've just got, their file servers are just racks of Linux machines just running Git. And the Git repositories that they host look a lot like what you clone. If you ever look in your .git directory when you've cloned a repository, that's what their file server is full of. And it's very fast. The problem is, that's not the way we built Team Foundation Server. We don't have a bunch of Linux boxes, and we don't just put things on a file system. We put things into databases like SQL Server. Visual Studio Team Services stores everything in Azure Blob Storage and SQL Azure. That's not going to work for Git. We kind of looked at it a little bit, and Git is a bunch of C and shell scripts and Perl and Python, and they all just expect the repository to be the way that it is. It's not easy to change that. So we figured out that we needed to deal with a project called libgit2. Libgit2 is a re-implementation of Git, also open source, also under the GPL. And the idea behind libgit2 is it's plucked out all the how do I write to a backend, or how do I write to a repository logic, and made it pluggable. So we could actually stop writing directly to a file system, and we could now write to SQL Azure and to SQL Server. And that was great. The problem with libgit2 is that in 2012, it wasn't really very complete. In fact, it was missing one really notable feature, and that's the ability to merge two branches in a Git repository. So we could stick our repositories into SQL Server and into Azure Blob Storage, but we could never do a pull request. We could never actually make that complete pull request button work because there was no way to merge repositories. And we're like, well, that's not so bad. At Microsoft, we've got a pretty big team building version control software. They've been doing it for a long time. We can write merge. We can absolutely add this to libgit2. The problem is that libgit2 is under the GNU General Public License. That means that anything we change in libgit2, we've got to give back to the community. We've got to publish all our changes back. That's one of the rights that you have as a user of the GNU Public License, is you get the source code to anything that's using it. One of the people using it is actually our competitor, GitHub. So if we make any changes to libgit2 to improve it, to add merge functionality, GitHub can also benefit from this. And so we had a bit of a concern. Is this important to us? Is this our competitive advantage? If we build this into libgit2, and we have, so that we can use it to merge pull requests in Visual Studio Team Services, and we do, then GitHub can use it too. And in fact, they do now. And in fact, they've seen massive improvements by doing so. The blue line is their original pull request merging code. It uses Git. It writes some files on disk. It's not super efficient, actually. The green line is the time it takes to merge Git repositories using libgit2. So it's way more efficient, both in terms of time and in terms of, say, power usage. So when a user clicks commit pull request, it's now faster. We made GitHub faster by doing this. We also reduced their costs. That's less CPU time, which saves, which means less cooling in their data centers. We basically, we're saving GitHub money. We're making the experience better for their users. Isn't that a problem? It turns out that libgit2 is really not our competitive advantage. Our merge code is not our competitive advantage. Nobody is selecting a Git repository provider at this point because they can click complete pull requests just a little bit faster on Visual Studio Team Services than on GitHub, right? Git repository hosting at this point is a commodity. We expect everybody to do it well, to do it quickly, et cetera. So libgit2 is not really our competitive advantage. Our competitive advantage at Microsoft actually comes in the ability to scale, right? We've got a bunch of people at Microsoft who are worried about hosting enterprise Git repositories, hosting huge Git repositories. So our competitive advantage is in the ability to scale to that direction. GitHub, world's largest Git hosting provider. Microsoft Visual Studio Team Services will never be that. But we will host the world's largest Git repositories. So that's where we compete with GitHub. So ultimately, open source is not a zero-sum game. You know, you can actually collaborate with your competitors, and you can be successful. The thing is, you've just got to know what you are able to collaborate on and what you need to protect, because you do have a competitive advantage. You need to keep it. You need to make sure that you don't give it to your competitors, right? But you've got to understand what that is first. So once you've done your homework, once you've figured out why you need open source and what that need is, and understand your competitive advantage that only you are bringing to the market and that you don't want to give up, it's time to convince your boss that you need to do this. And this is a tricky one, right? This is a bit political. This is a bit challenging. The easiest place to start is with your coworkers, just your immediate coworkers that you sit next to and talk to every day. These people are your friends, I hope. I hope they're your friends. I hope you have friends at work. If you don't, we may have like problems that open source can't solve in your organization. But no, go and talk to your coworkers. They will validate your ideas really quickly. And you'll start hearing pushback from them, probably. I had, actually, surprisingly recently, I had a coworker tell me that we couldn't use some project because it was open source, and we couldn't run it in production because we needed to be secure. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Our code is written in C#. The .NET framework is now open source at this point. This is ridiculous, right? So you'll start getting this pushback immediately from your coworkers, unless they're like totally on board already, and awesome if they are. But that'll help you refine your message that you're going to continue to bring to other people within your company. And it's great if you have somebody, one of your coworkers, who is convincing. For me, I'm actually not all that convincing. I'm bad at sales. My buddy Martin, the one in Northern Ireland, he is quite clever, and he has a brilliant accent, and he uses phrases that don't make any sense in American English, and everybody loves that. Everybody loves Martin. So when he came up with this crazy idea to put Git into VSTS, it was obvious that he was the one that was going to push it through management. If you are not super persuasive and charming and British like my buddy Martin, that's okay, because you probably have a resource within your organization that is good at all of these things. And it sounds a little weird, but it's your sales team. I know that most of us as engineers are used to our sales teams going and promising something to the customer that doesn't exist in our product, and then coming back to us and telling us that they already sold it, and we have 2 weeks to actually get it out the door. So there's a lot of antagonism between sales teams and engineering teams often. But there's two things that your sales team does really, really well. The first one is they talk to your customers all the time. So they can validate that you've actually found a need in the business that needs to be filled. Because you're going to go to them, and they're going to say, oh, thank God. I absolutely have to have Git hosting in Visual Studio Team Services. I have to have Git support in Visual Studio. Customers are walking away from deals because of this. And your salespeople know money, right? So the concern is that when you talk to them about this, they may just go tell the customer that it'll be there in 2 weeks and that you have, but try to head them off. The risk, of course, is that your sales team comes back and says, I have no idea what Git is. No customer has ever told me this before. And so either you're way, way ahead of the curve, or maybe you need to rethink what you're doing a little bit. So they will provide excellent input. They've talked to the customers, and they can bring that information to you. The second thing that they do really well is convince people of things. Their job is to go to your customers, get them to open up their pocketbook, and just throw money your way, right? And that is very helpful because you can enlist them to help convince the rest of your organization that this is a good idea. Because when you go into a meeting, if you're anything like me, your bosses know what's coming, right? They probably see you get all starry-eyed when you talk about the MIT license or the GPL, and they know that you are coming in with a bit of an agenda, that you are pushing open source, perhaps just for the sake of pushing open source. And even if that's not what you're doing, even if you really do need this project to solve your problem, they may decide not to listen to you because they've decided you're an open source zealot. It totally happens. Probably happens to me, to be honest. Your sales team? They are not burdened with this ideology. They care about closing deals with customers. So if you trot them into an executive meeting and they say, we absolutely have to put Git into Visual Studio, people don't think it's just because, hey, Git is shiny. They think it's because it's going to close deals. So once you've got that immediate sort of setup in place where you've convinced a core team around you, your immediate coworkers, it's time to go up the next level. Talk to your management. And this is tricky. This was really tricky for us within the TFS team because, so by the time we really started talking about this, I had actually moved out of the cross-platform team and onto the version control team. The version control team that had been building the centralized version control system. And my boss had been listening to customers for years tell him all the things that he needed Team Foundation servers, centralized version control system to do. It needed to have the ability to audit things and really fine-grained reporting and permissions. Maybe you have some file and you can give everybody in accounting access to that file except these 3 people. And only these 2 people can write to it, and only this 1 person can branch it. It lets you go crazy on permissions. In Git, that's not true. In Git, you can read a repository, and if you can read it, you can write to it locally, and maybe you can push it. It does not have the same sort of fine-grained accounting, permissions, all these things that we'd been hearing from customers for years that they absolutely had to have. So we got a lot of pushback very, very quickly from our management. And if we went up the chain to my boss's boss, it turns out he'd been hearing the same thing because he used to run the version control team, and so did his boss. I had this whole organizational structure of people who had been building this version control system for years. And so it was a bit of a tough sell. For us, we got everybody in our team to read this one book. It's by Clayton Christensen. It's called The Innovator's Dilemma. The idea is that it sketches out technologies into, broadly, 2 types. You've got sustaining technologies. Team Foundation version control was an example of a sustaining technology. It's the incumbent. It does what it does. He uses a number of actual examples. I think the steam-powered, some steam-powered machinery was one example. It was very powerful, able to do all of the construction tasks that you could possibly throw at it, except it was huge, kind of like Team Foundation version control. And then a newcomer came along. For them, it was much smaller machines that were powered by a gas or a diesel engine. And the immediate thing that the people building the old incumbent technologies do is they look at that and they say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody ever choose that over my complete solution? But they're cheaper and they're easier to use, just like Git. Well, maybe not easy to use. We're working on that one, but they're definitely cheaper. They don't necessarily solve all of the same problems, but they solve enough of the problems that the customers become interested in. That's a disruptive technology. So once we finally started to understand that we had been building this sustaining technology and Git was coming in to disrupt the marketplace, we realized that we could have both inside of our product, right? So it's going to take some social engineering to convince all of your management that this is necessarily a good idea. So for us, we were able to just support both. Next, we had to convince our lawyers. And Microsoft's lawyers are a tough bunch. These are the people who, when they bought our company, told us that we had to get rid of one of our products. So we were not enthused by this meeting at all. In fact, we decided that we were going to just try to steamroll them. So we scheduled this meeting, we sat down with our lawyer, and we decided that we were just going to tell him everything about open source and the GPL. We were basically going to just talk for the entire hour or whatever we had scheduled with this guy. And we were just going to make sure that he couldn't say no by the end of it. That's all we wanted to do, was just not let him really start thinking too much about this or talking too much about it. We just wanted to keep him from saying no. We figured after that, we didn't know what we were going to do. We just wanted to contain the no. So we sit down and we start talking to him and we outline what open source is, what the GPL is, what Git does, how our customers need it. Here's some data, here's some graphs. We just talk. Every time he tried to open his mouth, we would just keep talking. And finally, by the end of it, I mean, the poor guy was exhausted, right? By the end of it, he looks at us and he says, well, you've given me a lot to think about, but I think this is a great idea. Now, when I go home at night and hack on my projects, I can publish them with Visual Studio up to GitHub. And we're like, what? It turns out our lawyer in the DevTools legal team has a bachelor's in computer science from MIT. He's a better programmer than I am, it turns out, and now he's a lawyer too. So he totally got it. Your lawyers will actually surprise you from time to time. A lot of times, you think that their goals are just to mitigate risk in your company and to say no. And of course that does happen, but ultimately they realize, I hope, that you need to get software out the door or products out the door, and they need to be able to really enable that. And sometimes that means open source. At least it did for us, even in a company that thought Linux was a cancer several years ago. Once you've got your lawyers on board, there's always one person. There's always one person in a company, or maybe a few people on a board of directors, who have to give a final sign-off on something. If you do something stupid and they weren't consulted on it, they're going to fire your ass, right? For us, that was Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer, who says that open source shows the characteristics of communism. I could have mined more quotes. I just had to stop making slides with Steve Ballmer's picture on them. And I wasn't in this meeting. I really, really, truly wish I had been. My understanding is that we basically outlined for Steve that we were going to start losing market share, that developers loved GitHub, that developers loved Git, and we had to support Git in our tools. We had to put Git into Visual Studio and Visual Studio Team Services. And I would like to think that then Steve stood up and did this.
Developers, 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 developers.
Because
yes,
you can say a lot about Steve Ballmer. He's a little excitable, he's a lot sweaty, but he actually means this. He really believes that developers are the inroads to making Microsoft a great company. He really does believe that in his heart. Remember that Microsoft started out as a dev tools company. We started, before there was a Windows, before there was an Office, there was Microsoft Basic. We were building compilers and dev tools before anything else. So it still is really, truly in our heart. So you will have to convince your senior leadership, and hopefully they will do the right thing, right? Even if they think that open source is communism, they will still see that at the end they need to support developers or whatever it is that your company does, that you may need open source to make that happen. Of course, now it's a lot easier within Microsoft. My senior leadership looks like Scott Guthrie, who loves open source on Azure, and the same with Satya Nadella. So it's gotten a lot easier for me in the last several years when I start talking about open source within the company. But you do need to convince all of the stakeholders. So make sure that you've done your homework in those first 2 rounds. Make sure that you have identified that business need and can distill it and explain it to an executive or your management. Let them explain that to the executives, going up the chain. And make sure that you know what you're giving up, that you're not giving up the keys to the castle, that you're not giving up the secret sauce that makes your company what it is. But you've got to know what that is before you know that you're not giving it up. But once you've got the okay, that's awesome, right? Well, yes. But while you're building this new software on this open source, or once you're starting to publish your own open source contributions, you've got to keep it legal. So within your company, you need to make sure that your developers know that there are different types of open source licenses. You don't need everybody in your company to be an expert on how the GPL differs from the MIT license or the BSD license. Wait, which one? There's 2 of them. There's a 2-clause version and a 3-clause version. Not everybody in your company needs to know this by any means, right? That's what your lawyers are fundamentally for. What you need people on your team to do is know that there are different open source licenses. It's not just like some free-for-all. It's not like they can just grab anything off the internet and use it now. There are different licenses and they have different rights and responsibilities, right? Some licenses grant the end user of a software different rights. Like, again, the GNU General Public License says that if you change this source code, you need to make that available to the people who are using your software. They need to be able to modify what you've given them. Okay? It's a very important right that the GPL allows for. But not every license requires this of you, right? So you need to educate your users that there are different types of licenses and that they need to run it by somebody before they just pull some software on the internet and start using it. Maybe if you're a 4 or 5 person company, they get to make this decision themselves. You can empower them. But if you're a company the size of Microsoft, there probably needs to be some layers of what's the word I'm looking for? I'm going to say bureaucracy, but I don't really mean it like that. But there needs to be some layers of control. Okay? And you need to educate your legal team. I don't mean you need to go to them and say, hey, guys, this is how the GPL works. Hopefully you have lawyers that understand this. Your lawyers are technical, right? Mine, again, better programmer than I am. So your lawyers will get this, and if they don't, find some outside counsel that does to do a quick consultation. Okay. So I don't mean that you explain how these licenses work. I mean you need to explain to them how you are going to be using open source and the types of licenses that you're going to be using, and then let them educate you on what that means. So let me give you a concrete example. My lawyer came to me and said, hey, so you're using libgit 2 in Visual Studio. Great. It's under the GPL license. Yeah? How are you going to follow the license agreement? How are you going to make sure that users can get your modified version of the source code? And I said, well, we're going to point them to GitHub. And he's like, no. I'm like, yeah, of course we are. What else would we do? GitHub is where open source lives, right? Of course we're going to point them to this GitHub repository. He's like, no. We hadn't really considered that when you put some code into Visual Studio 2013 and sell it to somebody, that code is out there forever. If in 20 years somebody finds some machine that can run Visual Studio 2013 and boots it up, installs Visual Studio 2013 on it, and realizes that our Git implementation can't talk to a modern, futuristic Git repository, they need to be able to make those changes, if they want, to support that. And in 15 years, 20 years, GitHub may not still exist, right? I mean, I hope it does. I think GitHub's great, but there's no guarantee, and we need a legal guarantee. That's what the GPL provides. The GPL provides the rights to the end users that they can do this, even 15 or 20 years down the road. There's no expiration date on it. So he challenged us to come up with a new system, and now if you install Visual Studio 2013, it'll drop the source code that we used, the exact code that we compiled, into your applications folder. And you've got the instructions on how to rebuild it. You can make changes, you can rebuild it, and then you can swap it in to Visual Studio 2013. That's what that license requires us to do. And people actually do this. This isn't hypothetical. You can find like a Stack Overflow thread where somebody has provided the instructions for how to pull this code out, add some new feature to it, build it, and put it in. And I was thrilled. I was overjoyed that somebody had actually taken the time to exercise their rights. So you need to talk to your lawyers and make sure that you understand how to give users their rights. Okay? You can level it up. If you're using a lot of open source, you can automate your compliance scanning. What do I mean by that? Well, so when we started looking at taking libgit2 into Visual Studio and VSTS, we talked to our lawyers and we're like, hey, so this is all under the GPL. And they're like, great, prove it. We're like, well, here's the license file. We're like, no. We actually had to go through and identify the provenance of the source code in libgit2. We had to figure out where the source code actually came from. Because if somebody writes it and opens a pull request against libgit2, that's fine. That's covered under the GPL exactly like it says it is. But if somebody goes and finds some website and copies and pastes some code that they didn't own, well, what was the original license of that code? Was that under the GPL? Was it under the MIT license? Was it just a blog that somebody wrote that has no license at all? It just has a copyright statement? You can't use that. That is not compatible with the GPL. So you've got to figure out where this code came from. And there are, thankfully, some tools that can help. Like there's this tool called WhiteSource. It's basically just a giant database. It's just this corpus of all the software it's ever seen and the license. So if it's going through, say, libgit2 that says it's under the GPL, it can just walk through the source code and say, well, actually, this function right here, I know where that actually came from. It's actually a Stack Overflow answer. And what is that licensed under? Stack Overflow even changed the license that all of the code on its site is under. So it can help you make sure that you understand the license that you're using. This is probably not super important if you're a very small company. This is super important if you're Microsoft. We're super worried about doing something really stupid and getting sued for it, right? And I say that, but you shouldn't be afraid of open source. Open source developers want you to use their software, right? I'm the maintainer of libgit2 now. I want you to use libgit2. Nothing would make me happier than actually some validation that the nights and weekends that I spend hacking on this crazy project are actually worth it. Nothing would make me happier than you using it, right? I'm not laying some trap for you where I sue you if you use it. No, I just want you to use it. And the people that do, manage the rights of users, such as the Software Freedom Conservancy, they want you to use it too, but they want you to use it the right way, right? Nobody's getting rich suing people off GPL violations. I assure you, these companies thrive, are making do on donations, right? So make sure that you are responsible, but don't be afraid of this, right? It's super effective. And when you do it right, your lawyers are happy with you. This is the Microsoft DevTools legal team, all in GitHub t-shirts and making little hearts with their hands. So you can do this effectively, but you do need to make sure you keep it legal while you're writing the code. The other thing you need to do while you're working on using open source, publishing open source, is embrace the community. Because it's not some weird, rigid corporate structure. It's just a bunch of people who are doing this often because they love it, right? So you need to make sure that you fit into that community. You can't just go in with, let me give you an example. I had a manager at one point while we were starting to work on Git, and we weren't really getting the sort of movement, the speed, the velocity in the project that he wanted. He wanted us to ship quicker and quicker, and the maintainer of the project at the time was slowing us down. And he was like, well, should I have a conference call with him? Totally oblivious to the way open source actually works, right? The fact that this guy's title is manager doesn't mean anything to anybody on this project, right? They just, They just want to see code. So you've got to understand how to fit in the community. And the absolute biggest thing that I can suggest to you is that you don't fork. And I don't mean the GitHub terminology, the sort of retcon definition of forking, where it's this method that that is basically a permission model so that you can send pull requests up and get them into the original repository without having write access on the original repository. I mean, don't create a long-running second copy of a project. Don't create a fork. Get your changes back into the upstream project. Concretely, libgit2, we wanted to be able to support, again, SQL Azure and SQL Server and Azure Blob Storage. But we didn't want, the maintainers of the project didn't want to actually have that code in libgit2, right? So we had to go and build some nice abstract mechanisms, some interfaces for plugging this stuff in. And so that's how we were able to get those changes in. Otherwise, we would have had this second copy of libgit2 that we always had to keep merging new stuff in, and all of a sudden, if they refactor something, some interface, then it's totally broken us. It takes forever to actually make these changes. Maintaining a second copy of an open source project is just truly, truly terrible. My buddy Ben says that branching is an integration credit card. If that's true, forking an open source project is like a mortgage. It's something you've got for life. It is just a maintainability nightmare. So don't do it. Try to make sure that your changes get into the upstream project. Work with the community to make changes. We talk about the contribution funnel. You'll start out using a project, then you'll start opening bug reports, you'll contribute your time. Eventually, you'll start contributing code. If you're not careful, you could end up owning an open source project, which is very rewarding in many ways, but does impact your sleep schedule. If you are not using an open source project, if you decide to open source something yourself, which is awesome, there's no community to embrace. You might have to create that community. That's challenging. We did that at Microsoft with the .NET Foundation. We had a lot of success with using Git in VS and VSTS, and a lot of other teams around Microsoft had success with open source. So we decided to open source .NET, the .NET Core, ASP.NET, all that great stuff. And there was no community there for us to embrace. We had to create it. How did we do that? The best advice I can give you is to have fun. Make it fun for people to contribute your changes. The .NET Foundation sends out these awesome coffee mugs or teacups. And it might be hard to see, but they've actually got the contributor's name, their GitHub alias, and like the SHA-1 hash of the changes that they contributed. So this is like cool custom swag, and it gets people excited and it gets people talking because people love this stuff. I love coffee mugs with my name on it. That's amazing, right? If this is something that you're tasked with, Jono Bacon, J-O-N-O, bacon like the tasty, salty breakfast meat. Jono Bacon writes a lot about building communities, especially open source communities. So, and you don't have to just give away coffee mugs. It doesn't have to be that advanced. You can give away stickers. Like I've got Git stickers up here and Git for Windows stickers. Please come grab some if you want. But that's the sort of thing that people like, right? Give everybody stickers and save the coffee mugs for like the people you want to retain as contributors. It's really great stuff. It's very effective. Once you've done all this, you can finally ship your code, whether it's using an open source component or shipping an open source component. For us, we stuck, again, Git into Visual Studio and VSTS, and all of a sudden, people went from hating us to loving us. It was great. We were really, really successful with Git. And again, that was one of the many reasons that Microsoft was able to start open sourcing so much other stuff. We open sourced so much that we built the .NET Foundation in order to manage how much we were open sourcing. And we've even started taking outside projects into the .NET Foundation. Super successful with that. We became the organization on GitHub with the most contributors to open source projects. Awesome. And this actually, falls out into larger effects. Contributors to the .NET project in 2015, it grew so much just 2 years later. And I said earlier that, good publicity isn't a reason that you should do open source. Not by itself anyway. But you do get good publicity when you start getting this right. Microsoft is often now in Hacker News, and even Slashdot, which I don't know how long you've been around the internet. Slashdot used to not love Microsoft so much, but even they are saying some better things about us these days. So we were really happy with this. We were super successful. There's some weird second-order effects that start to happen when you start getting good at open source. The .NET Foundation has a little bot that manages its, if you were in John Galloway's talk earlier, this will sound familiar. The .NET Foundation has a little bot that sort of manages contributions. So if you submit a pull request to an open source project that's managed by the .NET Foundation that requires a contributor license agreement, the .NET bot will pop in and say, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to go fill out this paperwork for us. And as a result, .NET Bot's GitHub contribution graph is amazing, right? I'm envious of that down there. The thing about that is that .NET Bot has actually been so successful on GitHub that he has started getting, or she, I actually don't have any idea what .NET Bot is. .NET Bot has started getting recruiter spam email. Please, .NET Bot, come work for us. You must be great. And of course, this recruiter spam is probably from a bot itself. So now we have bots emailing bots about bots. And I'm pretty sure that was, kind of how the world started to end in a Terminator movie. But I'm not going to focus too much on that. And you shouldn't either. You should instead focus on the success you've had using open source and contributing to open source. If you get this right, once you've started doing this inside your organization, contributing to open source, you can kind of turn it back around. We call that inner source, when you start adopting the methodologies of open source projects inside your firewall. If you, I don't know how many of you have seen this. This is a fun comic from, I think it was from 2011. It was made by Manu Cornet at Google. And it's the organizational structures of various large enterprises. Let me zoom in on Microsoft's. Having worked at Microsoft for a long time, I can tell you that this feels totally true. It's very sad, but often the business units don't always get along. We don't actually talk about it in these terms. We call them working in silos. Sounds a lot better, doesn't it? We say that the Windows team is in a silo, and Visual Studio is in a silo, and Office is in a silo. What do I mean by that? Well, the Windows team needs Visual Studio. They need the compilers to be able to build Windows. The Visual Studio team needs Windows. It runs on Windows. But some weird things happen when organizations don't talk to each other. So the Windows team, this is a true story. The Windows team found a compiler bug in Visual Studio. And instead of going and getting the compiler team to fix that bug, they just fixed it themselves and checked in the version into their source tree and never even worried about talking to the Visual Studio team. It's like, wow. That's some dysfunction right there. By learning the lessons that we did with open source, we decided that we wanted to tear down those silos. We wanted to get the company communicating better. So we set off to do what we call our one engineering system, but the crux of that is adopting more open source-like workflows within the company. So now at Microsoft, all of the source code for all of the projects is public within the company. It's hosted in Git repositories on Visual Studio Team services, and they all accept pull requests, even from across the organization. So the Office team, for example, writes an Android app and an iOS app. And they host it in Visual Studio Team Services. They do their builds there. And they came to us and said, hey guys, to be able to submit this to the various stores, to the Android store, to the iOS store, we actually need to be able to code sign this during the build. And the build team in VSTS said, well, yeah, I hear you, but that's not really on our radar right now. The Office team went away and said, this is problematic. So they wrote it themselves. And instead of just checking it into their repository, like we used to do around Microsoft, they opened a pull request. And the build team came back and said, this is amazing. Can you change this? Yeah, sure. Okay, can you change that? Oh, yeah, sure. And then they merged that pull request, and now everybody can code sign Android and iOS builds in VSTS. So this is benefiting not just the whole company now, but all of our users, all of the end users of VSTS. So it's amazing. So by default, everything in Microsoft is shared with everybody else in Microsoft. That's true even of the Windows repository. It's now in Git. We just did a lot of work to make this happen because Git is excellent at a lot of things, but holding big repositories is not one of them. And Windows is the biggest repository, the biggest Git repository anyway. 4 million files taking up 300 gigabytes. We had to do a ton of work to make both Visual Studio Team Services handle this, but also Git. We did a ton of work in Git. It's all open source. We added some crazy stuff to Windows to be able to make this happen. It's all also open source if you're interested in that, aka.ms/largest Git repo. So yeah, so now we're successfully hosting the largest Git repository in the world with open source style contributions. So that's how you can level up. Once you've gotten good at open source, turn it back around and do it inside your firewall. So find your business need, that thing that you need open source to solve. Make sure that you understand what makes your company valuable, what's unique to you, and don't give that up. Convince everybody that you need to do this. While you're doing it, make sure that you're doing it responsibly. Keep it legal, right? And then celebrate your success and level up your own engineering practices. We are about out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll hang around after. If you don't want to, if you want to get to the next thing or, grab a cup of coffee or something before the next and last talk of the day, that's cool. Hit me up on Twitter. I'm at eThomson. That's the best way to reach me. But, I just want to emphasize that I'm just one of the many, 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 many contributors within Microsoft to open source projects. And we've been very successful. You can too in your company. Thank you so much.